Holy Spirit.
Amen.
There's so many people in this story. So many people with so many different relationships to Jesus, each of them engaging with Jesus in their own way. I think for many of us who hear the reading of the Passion of Christ, the person of St. Peter often comes to the forefront. Of course, the Passion is that of Christ. It is Christ's suffering. The suffering seems so profound. The faithfulness Christ maintains in the midst of the suffering seems almost beyond us. And so I think we tend to draw our gaze more to Peter because we understand that a bit more. Whether we want to admit it or not, we probably often find ourselves reflected in the person of Peter. Peter was a committed disciple, the one who first spoke out the truth of who Jesus was. No shame, confident and sure. When Jesus says at the Last Supper that one of the disciples will betray them, they are all distressed. All of them say, "Surely not I." But after the supper, after the institution of Holy Communion, when the disciples go to the Mount of Olives, Jesus says more. Whereas earlier he had said that just one of the disciples will betray him, Jesus now expands and tells them that every single one of them will desert him. Peter, though, brave Peter insists, even though all become deserters, I will not. And Jesus sadly tells Peter that he'll actually deny Jesus 3 times before the cock has a chance to crow twice. And then sure enough, we watch it like watching a train wreck in slow motion, unable to stop it as Peter denies Jesus once, then again, then finally 3 times, hearing the cock crow at the 3rd denial, as Peter, we are told, breaks down and weeps. And as you and I watch the tragedy that is the failures and denials of him who was supposedly the greatest of the disciples, I do think we likely see a bit of ourselves in that. Perhaps we see our own grand ideals for discipleship, the sort of Christian we want to be, we believe we are called to be, we strive to be. We see our commitment to Christ set against our own failures so often to live up to that commitment, to live up to our own ideals for who we want to be in God's world. And in Peter's claims that he doesn't even know Jesus, we hear our own denials as well, echoing back to us the times when we, through what we have said or through what we haven't said, or through what we have done, when we have acted as though we don't really know who Jesus is at all. Of course, Peter's just one person. His failure is interrelated with the failure, the desertion of all the disciples. Because Jesus is right, when the road of discipleship, the road of following Christ reaches its most difficult moment, all of them desert him and flee. There's even this curious mention in the Garden of Gethsemane of a certain young man who was following Jesus, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. Mark tells us that the soldiers caught hold of the young man, but that he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. One commentator notes in this scene, one of those who had been called to leave everything to become a disciple instead literally leaves everything to become a non-disciple. Some scholars have suggested that this young man who runs off naked is actually St. Mark himself. That this is how St. Mark places himself in the gospel that bears this name. I think one of the reasons why the failures of the disciples, the betrayal of Judas, the naked flight of Mark, the denials of Peter, the fleeing of the rest of them, one of the reasons this hits us so hard as we read the narrative is because we know what it's like. All of us know what it's like at some level to be forsaken. All of us have probably at some point in our life felt the feeling of someone we loved, someone we trusted, pull away from us when we needed them most. Or we've been on the other side and forsaken someone when they needed us. That word forsaken has rich, powerful meaning that brings to mind stories of our own experiences. It's also, interestingly enough, a word that Jesus uses in this passion narrative. Each of the Gospels depict different words as being the last words that Christ uttered before he died. But in St. Mark's Gospel, the last words of Christ are found in his quotation at the beginning of Psalm 22, as Christ cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It's a painful note for the life of someone like Jesus to end on. The other disciples have much better things, much more comforting things. Jesus saying, "It is finished," or Jesus giving up his spirit, but not Mark. Mark has Jesus crying out that he feels utterly forsaken even by God. What a mystery this is to us, God forsaken by God. It's not one that can be easily explained theologically, and yet here it is presented to us in so much stark contrast. And I have to say, I think it is here. I think it is here that we find the power and point of the cross. Because the hard and difficult truth of the gospel is that on the cross, Jesus takes on our pain, our sin, our suffering, our forsakenness. All of those people you have abandoned, or that you have walked by or turned your sight away from in their time of need. All of those forsaken people, people you should have stood alongside, people you should have helped. For all of them, Christ chooses to be forsaken too by us. He chooses this so that the forsaken will never be alone. He places himself right there in their place at the top of that forsaken hill, representing all forsaken places in the world. And perhaps even more meaningfully, for all those times you may have felt forsaken in this world, all the times you may have felt abandoned by those you loved, maybe even abandoned by God at times. Christ takes that abandonment on his own shoulders, bears that pain, bears that theological confusion. Christ allows himself to be forsaken by God, and as he does that, as God incarnate, he comes alongside us. He comes alongside you in your abandonment. By choosing to be forsaken and come alongside all the forsaken and suffering of the world, Christ ensures that no one will ever suffer alone, forsaken again. That God will always be there, whether they see God or not, whether we see God or not. And so, as one of my favorite commentators on this Passion Gospel notes, this story is not truly at its heart about the suffering and the death, though it's powerfully there. Though we see our own suffering and death in the story of the suffering and death of Christ, that's not the heart of what is going on. The heart of this story is an important truth, that our relationship with God will always hold fast. The relationship holds no matter what you've done, no matter where you've wound up. Christ chooses to go there with you. In true, he often doesn't fix it, because sometimes pain and guilt really can't be fixed. It must be walked through if it is to be real. But Christ chooses to sit there with you in your pain, in your anger at God, in your guilt or sorrow. He chooses to sit there with you even if you clench your eyes tight and insist he's not there. He is. He chooses to feel your pain, to take it onto his own shoulders, so that you may know that you're never forsaken. You will never, never be forsaken. And I don't think we really understand it. I think it is a massive, massive mystery of faith. Truly, in the depths of our sorrow, feeling the burden of our guilt, we often don't understand how God could be here with us in these dark places. It doesn't make any sense. And we don't even often recognize God when God is here. But I don't think faithfulness has a whole lot to do with recognition. I don't think faithfulness has a whole lot to do with seeing things as they are, even though we want to so bad, even though we think that's what our faithfulness must mean. I think faithfulness is more than that. Because notice the women in the story. At the beginning of the story, it's a woman who anoints Jesus with perfume. She does it as an act of love, not understanding what she's even doing. She has no understanding of what this is, of what this profound moment means. She just knows the relationship is there and this relationship will hold. And so she gives an extravagant, foolish gift, anointing Jesus. Christ is the only one who knows what's going on, who knows that this is done in anticipation of his impending death and burial. And then at the end of the story, what happens? Women show up once more to do what? To anoint him once more. But just like the woman at the beginning, the women at the end don't really seem to understand. They don't understand what God is doing. They don't see it. They just know that this relationship will hold, even if they have failed, even if all of us have failed, that this relationship will hold. And so they show up anyway. These women who were looking on from a distance, who had followed him in Galilee, other women as well from Jerusalem who had seen him along the Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross. They watch as Joseph of Arimathea places the body of Christ in the tomb. They see where the body is laid, and then after the Sabbath, they come back, bringing their spices, their other ointments, so that they might anoint his broken and bruised body. But they don't understand. They don't understand the truth that actually there will be no need for a further anointing. That's not what is going to happen. That's not how this story will end, because that body's already been anointed and that body is already changing. But by showing up, I think, by showing up even in the midst of their doubt, in the midst of their confusion and pain, showing up even though they don't understand a word of how any of this makes sense, of how their lives make any sense anymore, because it's all been thrown to hell, quite literally. They show up and make manifest the truth that the relationship holds. They show up and present to all of us this beautiful picture of the fact that no one will ever be forsaken. They insist that they don't understand it, that this is all, they've all failed, but still no one deserves to be forsaken. They know that though you and I may often run from Jesus at times of our life, that in the end Jesus is always there, coming up alongside of us, inviting us home. Whether or not we understand any of this, Christ always invites us to come back home. And when we arrive at that place, when we arrive at that hole in the ground, that tomb carved out of rock, that symbol of all the things we've gotten wrong, or that symbol of all the ways that we feel like God has abandoned us. When we arrive at that tomb, that place of sin and grief, that place where all seems lost, bringing only what meager gifts we can, not understanding anything but wanting to hope beyond hope that this relationship will hold, we will not find the pain we thought would be there at that cave. We will find something much different in that hole in the earth. Be not afraid, beloved of God, for this relationship will hold.